The lake had frozen solid by the first week of November, which was early even for northern Ontario, and Brennan Ford had not spoken to another person in 11 days. That was not unusual. Since retiring from the teams 4 years ago, he had built his life around the kind of silence that most people spend their whole lives running from. The cabin had been his father's and his grandfather's before that, a low-roofed place on the eastern shore of Jackfish Lake, 2 hours north of Sudbury, on roads that turned to gravel after the last gas station. He had driven up in late September, the back of his truck loaded with enough firewood to last the winter and enough bourbon to last considerably longer. He had not told anyone where he was going. There was no one left who would have asked. His wife, Carolyn, had died 22 months earlier, pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end, and he had been present for all of it. The kind of present that leaves a man feeling like he has been turned inside out and left to dry in the cold. After the funeral, after the condolence calls stopped, and the casseroles stopped appearing on the porch, after the grief counselor his sister had gently suggested. He said everything that grief counselors say, and none of it found purchase in him. After all of that, he had done the only thing that made sense. He drove north. The teams had trained him to function in the absence of comfort. What they had not trained him for was the specific weight of a king-sized bed that no longer needed to be made on both sides. He woke each morning at 5, out of habit, and spent the first hour of daylight sitting with a mug of coffee on the dock, watching the lake. In late October, the geese had come through in long, ragged formations, their calls carrying across the water with a kind of urgency he recognized. Going somewhere warmer, smarter than him, maybe. By November, there were no more geese. There was only the lake and the tree line, and the sound of wind moving through spruce boughs, and Brennan Ford sitting with his second coffee, thinking about nothing in particular, because thinking about particular things had become something he could only sustain for a few minutes, before the weight of it pressed too hard against his sternum. He was not fine. He knew that. He had enough self-awareness left to understand the distinction between surviving and living, and he understood which one he was doing. On the 12th day, it started to snow. Not the soft, cooperative snow of Christmas cards. This was a hard, lateral snow, driven by wind off the lake, the kind that found the gap between a collar and a neck and stayed there. Brennan had seen the forecast and ignored it, which was a thing he would later recognize as telling. Some part of him either didn't care about being caught in it or actively wanted to be. He drove into Walford to get propane. The roads were already bad by the time he left the hardware store, and he took the lake road home instead of the highway because it was shorter and because he knew every rut and curve of it by feel. He almost missed her. She was on the shoulder of the road near the old Pelletier property. What was left of it, the barn long since collapsed into itself. He saw a shape in the headlights that his brain cataloged first as a deer, and then in the next half-second corrected. Too low, too still, wrong color. He braked. The truck fishtailed slightly on the packed snow before holding. She was a shepherd, or mostly shepherd. Some lab in her maybe, around the ears. Dark and tan, snow crusted across her back and face, and she was not running from the headlights the way a dog with good options would have run. She sat in the snow with her head up, looking directly into the light, and there was something in that posture that stopped Brennan's breath for just a moment. He had seen that particular stillness before. In men, not dogs. Men who had run out of moves and had arrived, somehow at a pure and terrible calm. He left the engine running and the door open, stepped onto the road slowly, the way he had been trained to move in uncertain environments. No sudden angles, nothing that could be read as threat. "Hey," he said, not to anything in particular, just putting his voice into the cold air. She watched him. He crouched down, maybe 4 meters from her, and only then did he see the puppies. 2 of them, tucked tight against her belly, barely visible under the curtain of her coat. They were very small, young enough that they should not have been outside in any weather, let alone this. "Oh," Brennan said. The mother's eyes did not leave his face. He had done enough cold-weather training to do the math quickly and without sentiment. The temperature was dropping, the snow was not letting up, and those puppies were not going to last the night in the open. The mother knew it too. He could see it in the way she was positioned. Body curved around them, taking the wind on her back, giving them what warmth she had left. She was rationing herself, running the same calculations he was. He went back to the truck, found the old wool blanket he kept behind the seat, the one Carolyn had bought at a market in Ucluelet, the summer they drove the Island Coast Road together, the one he had not been able to take out of the truck since she died, because taking it out would have meant deciding what to do with it. He brought it back to the road and laid it open on the snow, a few feet from the dog. "Your call," he said. She looked at the blanket, then at him, then back at the blanket. It took perhaps 4 minutes. He stood in the snow and the wind, and he waited, which was another thing the teams had taught him, and one of the few things that had transferred cleanly into civilian life. The mother rose, slowly, and gathered both puppies with her nose, nudging them forward, and then she walked it to the blanket and lay down on it with a deliberateness that felt, to Brennan, less like trust, and more like a deal being struck between two parties who were both out of alternatives. He wrapped the blanket around them and lifted carefully, and set them in the passenger footwell with the heater aimed low. She did not resist. She watched him through the whole process with those amber eyes, and when he closed the door and went around to the driver's side and got in, she put her chin on the edge of the seat and exhaled. The sound of it did something to him that he could not have named. The cabin was warm. He had banked the wood stove before leaving, and the heat met them at the door. He made a bed out of old towels in the corner near the stove and transferred the family to it, and then he stood in his kitchen at 9 o'clock at night and thought, "I have no dog food." He had oatmeal and canned soup and an alarming quantity of bourbon, and precisely nothing that would sustain a nursing mother through the night. He found a can of salmon and some cooked rice from 2 days ago and mixed them together in a bowl, and when he set it down she ate with a focused intensity that told him she had not eaten in some time. He refilled the bowl. She ate that too. The puppies, blind still, squirmed against her when she returned, and she lay down and they found what they needed. He sat in the chair across from them and watched. He did not turn on the television. He did not pour the bourbon. He just watched the three of them in the firelight, this small family he had driven home through a snowstorm, and felt something shift very slightly in the architecture of the evening. He had not cared much about evenings lately. He fell asleep in the chair. In the morning the snow had stopped, and the world outside the cabin windows was the blinding, extravagant white that Brennan had grown up loving. The kind of morning you got maybe a dozen times a winter, when the whole of the Canadian Shield looked freshly made. He stood at the window with his coffee and looked at it, and for the first time in months did not immediately think of Carolyn. He thought about her 2 minutes later, with the particular ache of someone pressing a bruise to see if it still hurts. It did, it always would, but the 2 minutes felt meaningful, somehow. The mother was nursing when he turned around. She raised her head and looked at him with the measured, evaluating look he was beginning to understand was simply how she looked at things. "We're going to need actual supplies," he told her. She blinked. "I'm going to interpret that as agreement." He drove to Walford again. Came back with puppy milk supplement, real dog food, a collar, and, on impulse, a squeaky toy shaped like a moose that he placed in the basket without examining the impulse too closely. When he pulled into the laneway, there was a man standing at the end of it. He was older than Brennan, mid-70s, maybe, in a red plaid jacket that had seen 20 winters and a canvas cap with ear flaps down. He was standing very still in the way that people stand when they are not sure of their welcome. Brennan rolled down the window. "Didn't mean to intrude," the man said. His voice had the flat vowels of someone born within 50 kilometers of here and never relocated. "Name's Cedric. I'm the next property over." He gestured vaguely east, through the spruce. Brennan had seen the mailbox on his way in and out 100 times, but had never registered a neighbor. He had not been looking for one. "I saw your lights last night," Cedric said, "coming in late. Just wanted to make sure you were all right. Roads were bad." It was a reasonable thing for a person to say. An ordinary, neighborly thing. Brennan had been living so far outside of ordinary and neighborly that it landed strangely, like a word you've said too many times until it stops sounding like itself. "I'm fine," Brennan said. "I found a dog on the road, brought her in." Something changed in Cedric's face. Not dramatically, the man seemed to be someone who kept his reactions at low volume. But his eyes went to the cabin and then back to Brennan with a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "Shepherd?" Cedric said. "Dark tan, black saddle, you know her?" Cedric looked down at his boots for a moment. "She belonged to my son." The words fell between them in the cold air. "Belonged," Brennan said. "He passed in April. Hunting accident up north of here, near Chapleau." Cedric paused. "She's been running loose since August. I tried to take her in, but she wouldn't stay. Just kept going back to his property, the old camp up the road." He stopped. Started again more quietly. "I should have tried harder." Brennan thought about the dog on the road in the snow. The way she had sat with that terrible calm stillness. The way she had taken the blanket like someone accepting the last available offer. "She's all right," Brennan said. "Come in." Cedric sat at the kitchen table, with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and looked at the dog and the puppies in the corner with an expression that Brennan recognized because he had worn it himself. Looking at photographs of Carolyn, he was not yet ready to put away. Grief in its later stages, past the sharp edge of it, settling into something duller and more permanent. "I didn't know about the pups," Cedric said. "She must have had them out at the camp." "They're young," Brennan said. "Maybe 3 weeks." Cedric nodded slowly. "Stefan would have known what to do," he said. And then, as though he hadn't meant to say it out loud, "He always knew what to do with animals, more than with people. Which I mean as a compliment. How old was he?" 38. Cedric looked at his coffee. "He did a tour in Afghanistan, came back, couldn't quite find his footing. You know how that goes." Brennan knew exactly how that went. He went up north every fall, same camp, by himself to get his head straight. That's where it happened. Cedric was quiet for a moment. "I used to worry about him going alone. Then I'd think, well, he knows what he's doing out there. He's trained. He's fine." He shook his head slowly, the way you shake your head at an argument you've had with yourself too many times to win. Famous last words. Brennan said nothing. He had learned that sometimes saying nothing was the more useful thing. "You were in the service," Cedric said. "It wasn't a question." Brennan looked at him. "Like it," Cedric said, "and you knew how to approach her without spooking her. That's training. Or it's something close enough." "Navy," Brennan said. 21 years. Cedric absorbed this. Stefan was Army. Roto 2, Kandahar. He didn't talk about it much, but you could see it on him. Same way you can see it on some men when they've done hard things that nobody asks about afterward. Nobody asks about afterward. Brennan had spent 21 years doing things that required a particular kind of person, and left marks on that person that weren't visible from the outside. He had come home from every deployment to a wife who had not demanded explanations, who had simply been there with her particular, steady warmth, and he had never understood until she was gone how much of him had been held up by that warmth. Without it, some load-bearing structure had gone out of him. "My wife died 2 years ago," he said. He did not usually say this to people. He did not usually say it at all. Cedric looked up from his coffee. "Cancer," Brennan said. "Fast, I'm sorry," Cedric said. And then he said something that people rarely said. "It doesn't go away, does it?" "No. My wife, Miriam, she went 12 years ago. Heart." Cedric looked at the window, at the white outside. "Some days it's far enough back that you can get on with things. Some days it's like it's still fresh. Nothing to do about it. You just have to keep moving through the days." It was not a profound thing to say. It was the simplest, most obvious thing in the world. And yet Brennan felt it land differently than anything the grief counselor had said, than anything his sister had said, than any of the things people had said to him at the funeral. Or afterward, because it was being said by a man who was not trying to fix him, or console him, or redirect him. It was just one man telling another, "This is how it is, and I know because it's how it is for me, too." The dog got up from her corner and walked over to Cedric and put her nose briefly against his hand. He startled slightly, then let her sniff, and then slowly he rested his hand on the top of her head. "Hey, girl," he said very quietly. She stood there for a moment and then went back to her puppies. Cedric stayed for another hour. They did not talk constantly. There were long stretches of quiet that were not uncomfortable, in the way that silences between strangers usually are, and Brennan could not quite account for why. Maybe it was the cabin which had always had that quality. His grandfather had built it for hunting trips, for the company of men who communicated in economy rather than abundance. Maybe it was the dog. whose presence gave them both something to look at in the pauses. Maybe it was simply that they were both carrying the same species of loss and recognized it in each other the way veterans recognize each other, by some subtle frequency that doesn't require words. Before he left, Cedric stopped at the door. "Stefan's camp," he said. "I haven't been up there since April. Couldn't bring myself to go and deal with his things." He paused. "I might need to do that before the real cold comes in, if you wanted company for a drive up there sometime." It was offered carefully, without pressure, a door held open that Brennan could walk through or not. "Yeah," Brennan said. "I think I could do that." The days changed after that. Not dramatically, not all at once. The grief was still there. It would always be there. He understood that now it was simply a feature of the landscape he was living in. But the shape of the days was different. The mother, he had started calling her Willa in his head, without deciding to, the way names sometimes just attach themselves. Needed feeding 3 times a day and a walk morning and evening, which meant that Brennan's schedule was no longer entirely subject to his own indifference. Someone required something of him at regular intervals. It turned out that this was not an unwelcome thing. The puppy's eyes opened on a Tuesday. He had been watching for it and felt a disproportionate satisfaction when it happened. A warm, uncomplicated thing that he sat with for a while without analyzing it too hard. There were 2 of them, a male and a female, both with the dark muzzles and watchful ears of their mother. The male was already bold, rolling toward sounds and new smells with the absolute fearlessness of something that doesn't yet know what there is to be afraid of. The female was more considered, sitting back and observing before she moved. Carolyn had been like that. She would sit across from him in restaurants and watch the room before she settled in, cataloging and considering. He had always loved that about her. He had always told her she would have been good at his job. He did not think of this with pain, exactly. More with a kind of fond recognition. Here was a small creature who reminded him, in the most unlikely of circumstances, of a woman he had loved. He sat on the floor with the puppies in his lap and thought that was not a sad thing. That was, in some way he didn't have language for, exactly the opposite. Cedric came over on Thursdays. This was not arranged explicitly. The first Thursday it happened by chance, and the second Thursday Cedric appeared again at the end of the laneway in his red jacket. And Brennan had put the kettle on before he was halfway up the drive. Routine established itself through repetition rather than agreement, which was how the best routines always worked. They drove up to Stefan's camp on a Saturday in early December, when the sky was the flat gray that meant snow was coming but hadn't arrived yet. The camp was a 20-minute drive on a track that was almost impassable, and they had to walk the last quarter-kilometer through knee-deep snow. Cedric was quieter than usual the whole way in. The camp was a single-room place, neater than Brennan had expected. Hunting maps on the wall, carefully marked, a row of hooks by the door with everything hung exactly so. Not military precision, but something close to it. The precision of a person who found order calming. Brennan understood this viscerally. He had made his rack with hospital corners for 21 years and still did. There was a dog bed in the corner beside the wood stove. Willa's, he assumed. He did not point it out. Cedric stood in the middle of the room for a long time, not moving, not speaking. Then he walked to the shelf above the stove and picked up a photograph that was sitting there, face down, which told its own story. He looked at it for a while, set it back down, face up. "He looks like you," Brennan said. "He was a better man than me," Cedric said. "I was difficult when he was young. You know how some fathers are. I expected things a certain way, and he wasn't always able to be that way, and I wasn't flexible enough to understand it wasn't a failing on his part." He stopped. "I got there eventually. It just took me longer than it should have." "You got there," Brennan said. Cedric looked at him. "You got there," Brennan said again. "That counts." They packed up what needed to come out and left the rest. Cedric took the photograph and a folding knife that had been Stefan's grandfather's, which made it, Brennan supposed, his great-grandfather's knife now. On the way out, Cedric stopped at the door and took one last look at the room. "He would have liked you," Cedric said. He didn't like many people, but the ones he liked absolutely. Brennan thought about the dog on the road, about the way she had sat in the headlights with that awful steady calm, about the deal they had struck, two creatures out of options in the snow. "I like to think she brought me here," he said. "Willa." Cedric considered this seriously, the way he considered most things. "Could be," he said. "Animals know more than we give them credit for. Stefan always said that." They drove back in the gray afternoon. Brennan made soup. Willa came and put her head on Cedric's knee while he ate, and he rested his hand on her and looked out the window at the frozen lake with an expression that was not happy, exactly, but was something adjacent to it. Something Brennan recognized because he was starting to feel it himself, tentatively, like weight placed on a floor you're not sure will hold. The world was still broken in the ways it had been broken. Carolyn was still gone. Stefan was still gone. The lake was frozen and the spruce trees were full of snow, and the days were short and dark and cold, the way northern Ontario days are in December, which is to say they were beautiful in a way that does not ask anything of you except that you notice it. Christmas came quietly. Cedric drove over on Christmas morning with a tin of shortbread that Miriam's recipe had made for 40 years, and Brennan made eggs, and they sat at the kitchen table, while the puppies discovered the squeaky moose toy and conducted several investigations of its structural integrity. The female sat back and observed from a distance before attempting it herself. The male bit it immediately and with great confidence. "You giving them names?" Cedric asked. "I've been thinking about it," Brennan said. He had been thinking about it for a while. He had been thinking that the male, bold, immediate, head first into everything, he was going to call him Bravo. And the female, the watchful one, the one who sat back and took her time, her name had come to him in the dark 3 nights ago, and he had not second-guessed it. "The girl," he said. "I'm calling her Carolyn." Cedric looked at him over his coffee. "Is that all right?" Brennan said, which was a strange thing to ask another man, but felt necessary. "I think," Cedric said slowly, "that is exactly right." Willa stood up from her blanket in the corner and walked to the window and looked out at the frozen lake, and the morning light came through and caught the white of the snow and the gold of her coat, and somewhere in the spruce trees a chickadee said what chickadees say in the deep cold of a Canadian winter, which is nothing profound, just, "I'm here, I'm still here." Brennan sat in his grandfather's cabin in the middle of November's long aftermath and felt, for the first time in longer than he could precisely name, like that was true for him as well. He carved a sign that spring and hung it above the laneway gate, because his grandfather had always said, a property needs a name to know what it's for. He carved it from a piece of ash, the same ash he had been splitting for firewood all winter, and he used the small chisel he had found in the camp toolbox. It said, "Still here."